Let me start by saying that every Jew who's with us this Yom Kippur is miraculously lucky. In our 6,000-year history, there's rarely been a better place and time than right now for Jews in America. Far from being marginalized behind ghetto walls, we're living in a time and in a place where we're full citizens. We can stroll into synagogue for worship, and we have access to every level of education, politics, and commerce. Students of Jewish history know that all of this, is an exceptional time. So why then do I scan the headlines daily, expecting stories that are bad for the Jews? In the past few years, most of the news about our people involves anti-Semitism, conflict in Israel, or remembering the Holocaust. This is how the media projects us, victims, guilty simply because we're Jewish, and as a people who are alone. We've carried this title, which in biblical Hebrew is Am Levadad Yishkon, from a scene in the Torah. A non-Jewish prophet, Bilam, was hired by our enemies to curse us. He stands on the mountaintop, overlooking our encampment, our tents in neat order, neighbors helping neighbor, children playing safely. And he utters the words, Am Levadad Yishkon. They are a nation that is alone. He meant it as a curse. But before he could finish, God compelled him to bless us instead with the famous words, Ma tovu ohalecha Yaakov, mishkenotecha Yisrael. How good are your tents, O Jacob, your sacred dwellings, O Israel. For we were not like other nations. We are a people who aspire to bring equal law and justice for all. And we're not satisfied that this broken world is just how it is. We try to live by our ideals, and sometimes that's threatening to the status quo. A people who dwell alone? That's how it was during the pogroms in Europe and during the Holocaust. That's how it sometimes is for Israel and her defenders today. That's how it feels when there's a synagogue shooting. We know the mortification of finding anti-Semitic garbage littering our driveways on a Sunday morning right here in Georgia. Our collective experience has prepared us to stand alone if need be, living by a moral code and having the courage to be different. History has forged our resilience. But Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, Zikaron Lebracha, points out that the real danger to us now is that we might start to believe that we're somehow destined to always be alone, to believe the anti-Semites, that the state of being alone for Jews is somehow built into the universe, encoded into the human genome, and that it is our fate. If this becomes our attitude, says Rabbi Sachs, then this becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, and almost certainly will continue to happen. Why bother to make friends and allies if you know in advance you're going to fail? Anti-Semitism is not mysterious, unfathomable, or unexplainable. It's a complex malice that's mutated over time, and it has identifiable roots: social, economic, political, cultural, and theological. It can be fought. It can be defeated, but not if we believe that we're cosmically meant to be isolated outcasts. I personally know that we're strong and we can stand up for ourselves. In my experience, I've seen that when we build bridges, there is hope for a different path forward. I have faith that when we extend our hand, despite our historical trauma, it is often met by others. I believe that there are good people and that they can be reached, and that we have to try. 2 years ago on Yom Kippur, I talked about the normalization of anti-Semitism in America. And since then, it's only become more pronounced. The truth is that what's also grown are the opportunities to educate, make friends, and create allies. At Temple Emanu-El, we've made brave efforts to stand up against anti-Semitism, with guidance from the American Jewish Committee and the Anti-Defamation League. By now, you know that many of my high holiday sermons are not just about teaching, but are calls to action. Since the last time I spoke about anti-Semitism, we've called on you to brainstorm ideas of how we might have a local impact. From your responses, we collected 300 ideas and then pared them down to just 5. 5 realistic, achievable efforts that would move the needle through intentional collaboration. 5 groups of people who raised their hands and committed to follow through. The first group were parents who came up with a plan to reach out to local schools and county supervisors to talk about their Jewish students and to advocate so that our kids would not be penalized for missing class on our most sacred days. A reference guide of Jewish holidays was created and has now been widely shared 2 years running. A second group decided that when churches or mosques or synagogues experienced acts of hate, the decent thing to do would be to reach out. And that's what they did. On behalf of Temple Emanu-El, they quickly conveyed our solidarity. This gesture modeled the courage it takes to stand with those who are reeling from acts of violence. A third group solidified a tangible plan for our congregants who might experience anti-Semitism. We came up with a system so that our community could quickly mobilize on short notice. This step-by-step guide's available on our website. I hope that you never have to use it. But if you need us, we're here. You are not alone. The fourth TE team took a more delicate and long-term goal: to build friendships with local interfaith and interrace groups. Could we make connections and find commonalities so that we were known to one another? Could we learn from each other as allies and as friends? This piece of the initiative was slow to start, but now has real momentum, with Muslims from the Istanbul Cultural Center, Asian and Pacific Islanders from AAPI, and Presbyterians from St. Luke's in Dunwoody. We've made overtures to local Mormons, Baha'i, and the Catholic Church. All three have warmly responded. There are so many more relationships that could be made, but relationships take time, and it's going to take all of us. A few months ago, when the neo-Nazis stood outside Chabad in East Cobb with their heckles and their signs, it was the East Cobb Methodist Church who mobilized an interfaith rally for the Jewish community. Rabbi Dan Dorsch from Eitz Chaim remarked that this was the first time in recent memory that the Jewish community didn't have to host our own rally. It was our Christian neighbors who raised the flag, standing tall with us. A fifth group of congregants followed the philosophy that education is the best way to empower people. Their challenge was to educate our own congregation, an entire generation of Jews who've had the gift of not worrying about anti-Semitism, at least until recently. Now, raise your hand if you were one of the 700 people who heard Brendan Murphy speak at Temple Emanu-El this past year. This is such a cool story, and it's happening before our eyes. Brendan Murphy, who's a devout Catholic, is considered one of the best teachers at the Marist School in Brookhaven. When he graduated from Notre Dame about 30 years ago, he became a history teacher, a world history teacher. And his first year, his curriculum allocated a total of 12 minutes to teach about the Holocaust. He didn't know much about the Shoah, so he began to research. The more he dug, the more he discovered, painfully, that the Catholic Church has a long history of anti-Semitism, much of it based on polemic against Jews from more than 1,000 years ago that's been disproved and disavowed. Disproved because historians today have clearly proven that much of what the Catholic Church accused the Jews of could not have possibly happened. Disavowed almost 50 years ago by Pope Paul VI in a revolutionary document titled Nostra Aetate, which is Latin for "in our time." Nostra Aetate is considered a game changer, for it's the document that declared a new day between the Catholic Church and non-Christian religions. In it, the Vatican clearly stated that the Jewish people were not to be blamed for the death of Christ, and that anti-Semitism had no support in church doctrine. Both of these statements were in direct contrast to 2,000 years of Catholic attitudes towards Jews and their beliefs about us. Now, we Jews believe in tshuva, the chance to admit wrongs and make amends. And in doing so, relationships can be healed. Catholics have their own version of this, mea culpa, meaning that one is obligated to admit mistakes and then do your best to heal the hurt. When Brendan saw the role that Catholics had played in 2 millennia of Jewish pain, it became part of his life's mission to have the Catholic Church do tshuva, to admit fault, and to help heal Jewish-Catholic relations so that together we can move forward in a better way. For decades now, Brendan's been teaching Marist students about the Holocaust. and he travels with them every year to Auschwitz. We heard about this excellent Catholic teacher who was teaching Jewish history, so we were curious. We invited him to Temple Emanu-El to present his seminar titled, "Why the Jews?" And boy, did we learn a lot about how biblical verses had been corrupted, blood libels had been cast, and religious rites had been created to oppress our people. Not just the material, but the way Brendan presented this incredibly difficult history was so impressive that we recommended him to other local synagogues. Brendan's since spoken to Jewish audiences throughout Atlanta. But Brendan knows that where his message really needs to be heard is in Christian congregations. He shared with me that if he, who had a lifetime of Catholic education, had never heard a hint of Catholic responsibility for Jewish pain, and he had not known that theologically Nostra Aetate had absolved the Jews, then it was extremely likely that others were missing this knowledge as well. There are 1 billion Catholics in the world, and if they weren't taught their church's mistake in history or their Pope's decree, then their anti-Semitic attitudes might continue unchecked. What's more, the problem goes deeper than addressing the average Catholic, because many priests, including ones who lead congregations, also are unaware. Bolstered by his success at Temple Emanu-El, Brendan Murphy sent a letter of introduction requesting to teach a version of Why the Jews to 50 parishes around Atlanta. Out of the 50, only one responded, and the answer was no. You can imagine how disheartening this was to him and to us. Brendan knew that the only way to get into the churches was through Archbishop Gregory John Hartmeyer, the Archbishop of Atlanta, who's the head of some 200 Catholic parishes from Macon to Chattanooga. This is no small thing. It's not like getting an appointment with Rabbi Spike at TE. You call, we say, sure, you're in. It's not the same thing at all with a Catholic archbishop, who's several levels up from the parish priest in the Catholic hierarchy. There are introductions needed and stiff protocols without any guarantees of getting an audience. Through his connections at Marist, Brendan was able to get an appointment, and he asked a few of us to go with him. He wanted Jewish leaders to give testimony about his presentation, that it was an important historical lesson and impactful for Jewish-Catholic relations. We hoped that the Archbishop would be receptive to the mission and the message. You can imagine the tension that we all felt this past December as we were seated in the chancery of the Archdiocese. It seemed like we had one shot, and the stakes were high. When the Archbishop entered, we all rose, and he waved us to be seated. Brendan took in a breath that to me felt like a prayer, and with lowered eyes, he began speaking softly. He articulated his sincere gratitude to be granted an audience with His Holiness, the title used to address someone of the Archbishop's station. Brendan spoke of his Catholic education and his deep love for the church. Then, with a subtle change in voice, he shared how he had learned of the church's role in Jewish tragedy and the declaration by the Pope of Nostra Aetate. Brendan spoke of his Marist students and how he travels with them to Auschwitz each year. He shared his disappointment at the lack of reception from the Catholic parishes. And finally, Brendan Murphy asked for the Archbishop's help, vital help, to correct the great wrongs of the past with education, mutual respect, and a shared, hopeful future. When he was done, everyone was silent. I too took a prayerful breath and then spoke from the heart. I conveyed to the Archbishop how inspired we were by Brendan's courage and his tenacity. One by one, we went around the room, each of the Jewish leaders speaking with the utmost respect. And when we finished, again, there was silence, a moment. Then Archbishop Hartmeyer spoke, quietly at first, and it was clear from his demeanor that he was deeply touched. He shared what it was like growing up outside of Buffalo, New York, about his neighborhood and his community. He spoke about playing ball with Jewish kids his age and some of his close Jewish friendships. He then told us that he wholeheartedly embraced Nostra Aetate and its mission to face the past. He acknowledged that these conversations would be hard for everyone, but that they needed to happen. Then he thanked us for bringing this to his attention, and the Archbishop of Atlanta promised to help. Since then, Brendan Murphy has begun teaching his seminar to Catholic churches throughout Georgia. He's well received, and more invitations arrive every day. I asked him, "What do you think goes through the minds of the Catholic men and women who hear you?" He replied that most of them are surprised at what they didn't know and sad that the church they love so very much did what they did. Mea culpa, like tshuva, brings a sense of vulnerability. But with it, Brendan reports, there's a strong sense of resolve, a chance to think differently, to act differently, to build bridges, and extend hands of forgiveness and of friendship. Brendan has shared that the Catholic Church is slow to change, but this past year, we've been part of something powerful, and it is still unfolding. This is a beautiful story. I wish that we could duplicate it with every community who has a history of anti-Semitism. Part of the privilege that we have living as American Jews today is that we're not a nation that dwells alone. But at the same time, we have a responsibility to protect ourselves. Right now, as crazy as it sounds, it's impossible for law enforcement to prosecute someone for anti-Semitic hate crimes because there's no working definition of anti-Semitism in the state of Georgia. This means that anti-Semites can commit blatant acts of discrimination against Jewish people and then hide behind the lack of definition to avoid accountability. Mainstream organizations, mainstream Jewish organizations like Temple Emanu-El, are rallying around the widely accepted definition of anti-Semitism written by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. We need Georgia to adopt it too. This would protect Jewish kids from being terrorized in schools. It would protect us from anti-Jewish harassment, vandalism against our businesses and institutions, and violence against our people. And in the same way that it's wrong to hold Chinese Americans accountable for the actions of the Chinese government, or Mexican Americans accountable for the actions of the Mexican government, the IRA definition of anti-Semitism would protect Jews from being retaliated against for actions, real or perceived, by the State of Israel. The fact that we don't have this type of legal recourse is something that we can and that we must do something about. That's why there's legislation pending in Georgia. HB 30 is co-sponsored by Republican John Carson and Democrat Esther Panich. Esther is the only member of the Georgia General Assembly. Both she and John Carson will be here up on the bima at 2 o'clock this afternoon as our Yom Kippur speakers. They help us understand HB 30, why it's vital to push through this now, and how we can help. We hope that you'll join us. Representative Panich let me know that some of the elected officials who oppose HB 30 do so because they claim Jews haven't suffered enough, and we're doing too well to be a protected class. She disagrees. So do I. How about you? Tomorrow, I'm going to send you an email reminding you about this sermon with instructions on how you can help. Additionally, sometime between January and April, likely on short notice, we're going to ask you to physically show up at the State Capitol building. You may be asked to show up more than once. When there's deliberation about HB 30 or expectations of a vote, having people on the ground can sway decisions. I'm going to ask this of you because I am sure that passing HB 30 is the most impactful thing that we can do to combat anti-Semitism this year. My friends, we are American Jews living in exceptional time. How will we see ourselves? Condemned to forever dwell alone? Or do we have the courage to turn curse into blessing? We are a vibrant community of wonderful tents, dedicated not only to ourselves, but to all of humanity. We are a people with purpose, whose children can know and be proud of their Jewish identity. This is a place where we invite Shabbat angels to bless us as we gather together every Friday night, where Torah study nourishes every age, where we gladly share our Judaism with one another, and with joy transmit our amazing culture, wisdom, and traditions Mador Lador, from generation to generation. We here today are miraculously lucky, for we can change our narrative to make a future that our ancestors could only dare to dream. Their hard work and sacrifice is our inspiration. Our children are our motivation, for we are in the right time and we are in the right place. Now it's up to us to stand tall, not alone, and to try. Good Yontif.